Hello, everyone. We're exactly on the hour, and I would like to welcome everyone to our next upcoming webinar, which is all about formulating a big data strategy. One of my personal favorite topics to talk about. Before we get started with the webinar, let me take a brief moment to introduce myself. My name is Jan de Middelburg, and I'm the author of the Enterprise Big Data Framework. Today, I'm going to guide you on a path to help you to formulate a big data strategy, which is a question that I get asked a lot. In today's webinar series, you are participating through the Zoho webinar platform. If you would like to engage with us or ask any questions based on the content, or would like me to explain a particular topic, you can always ask questions on the left-hand side of this webinar application. By default, in a webinar, everyone is placed on mute. So if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A functionality, which is provided within this platform tool. Good, let's dive right into the content for today. Today, what we're going to be talking about is three main objectives. And these are the key things that I would like you to take away after the session today. I'm going to get started with explaining the need to start formulating big data strategies. And I would like to do that by always putting it into the bigger context. Where does a big data strategy fits in, and how does it relate to some of the other capabilities that are necessary to set up in an enterprise? I'll start with explaining a little bit around why this particular point is important and where you can get started in order to build capabilities. Then we're going to go towards the main point of this session today, which is detailed guidance on how to formulate a big data strategy. And what I will do today is provide you a 5-step, very simple approach that I've been using for the last 6 years in order to formulate big data strategies for major corporations. I find these 5 steps pretty much sum up the process that almost every organization, regardless of industry or size, can go through in order to effectively formulate a big data strategy. I've illustrated this with some examples, so I hope you'll find this useful, and hopefully that will be one of your key takeaways from the session today. In the last few slides, I've also given some examples. So to show you some examples of good big data strategies in practice, I've also provided a number of links where you can look at that a little bit more in detail. Good, now that you know a little bit more around what the structure of the session will look like today, let's get started and dive right into it. Good, before we get started with the content, let me just give you a very brief overview of who's hosting this webinar session today. This webinar is brought to you by the Enterprise Big Data Framework Alliance, which is an independent body of acknowledgement for the advancement of what we refer to as big data best practices. There's a lot of frameworks available in the world, but for big data specifically, there's always a lot of questions around what is the appropriate structure. With the Enterprise Big Data Framework Alliance, we're trying to step-by-step develop the structure regardless of the particular technology that you're using. You will see in this presentation as well that we're choosing a vendor-independent approach. So regardless of your technology stack, which industry you're in, or the size of your organization, or even which country you're located, we're going to be providing you with a uniform approach that hopefully can be very practical for your company as well. Good. Let me get started with explaining the need to establish a big data strategy. And I always like to start with one of the slides that shows the importance. We're living in the year 2020 right now. And as you can see in the middle newspaper article, you see that big data analytics is forecasted to be the most in-demand skill for 2022. There is a significant trend and increase in demand for people who have analytic skills and have the ability to query through large particular amounts of data. But since big data has become so tremendously popular, there's also very many cases the question, where do I start? What is a good moment? What I always like to say is that you can potentially spend the rest of your life analyzing all kinds of nice, cool, or interesting data. You will literally not be able to process all the data that exists out there in your particular lifetime. So in order to do that, you need to get started with focus. And that focus starts from the perspective of strategy. So let's have a quick look at what the research says. There's a lot of very famous newspaper articles, and you see some of the covers here of The Economist and Time, that explain how big data is providing organizations with a competitive advantage. Some magazines call it the world's most valuable resource. Other publications state that data is the new oil, gold, or even water with which organizations are operating today. And I strongly believe that this is true. Organizations that have the ability to make better decisions by analyzing data faster or cheaper or more adequately or accurately than any of their competitors will eventually win. Because all things considered, if you consistently make more data-driven decisions, you're going to be outperforming any competitor who doesn't. However, everyone is now familiar or knowledgeable about that need. But the research around the number of organizations that are able to implement that effectively tells a completely different story. On the slide in front of you, you see a research report that states that 32% of companies report being able to realize tangible and measurable value from data. So that's not a very significant or not even a majority number. So let's have a quicker look or more in-depth look at why that is the case. And this research report, which is coming from Accenture in 2019, states, and as the number one reason, that the lack of an enterprise data strategy that has C-level support is one of the main lacking reasons why these big data strategies are not successful. So that's one of the reasons why I've chosen this as the topic for today, because I think that having a little bit more knowledge on how do you properly define and implement a big data strategy is going to be a very valuable lesson. So I know that there are also some other reasons, but for today's scope, we're primarily going to focus specifically on the establishment of a big data strategy. So let's get started with putting that into the bigger picture. On the one hand side, almost every organization today is knowledgeable and aware about the opportunities that data bring, and they see the need to start transforming in a more data analytical driven organization. On the left-hand side of the slide, you see that organizations realize the need to change. There is typically willingness and budget available, and they also see the necessity to change. Many organizations have started with a digital transformation project or a data-driven transformation project and are underway to execute that. On the other side of this bridge, you see that there's also a lot of companies that struggle to realize that value from big data. There's typically a large number of failed projects. There are pretty strong costs associated with setting up a big data organization. And in many cases, there are also security concerns and lack of knowledge. And this is one of the big paradoxes that I see in a lot of organizations. On the one hand side, there's willingness and necessity to change. On the other hand, it's very difficult to do it right. So where do you start? What is the primary way in which you can start to do this in an approach that actually works? And one of the pictures I always like to show is the bridge that you see here in the middle. Because basically, this bridge helps people to cross from one side to the other. And the reason that I always like picking the picture of this bridge is for two reasons. The first one is that this particular bridge, if you look very closely, shows that the bottom is made out of glass. So it's very transparent. And if you're walking across it, you can literally see all the way down. That's kind of a metaphor for how much data there is. So you can watch down and you can see almost everything. However, you do need to still focus. And that's the second reason that I've chosen this bridge as an example, because this bridge provides structure. Without this bridge, people would not be able to make this gap or cross this gap between these two different worlds. For the people who are interested, this bridge is, by the way, located in China. So if you ever have the opportunity to visit this, strongly recommend it because it's a beautiful, beautiful structure. Good. Let's see how that structure works within the world of big data. And that is through the Enterprise Big Data Framework. The Enterprise Big Data Framework consists of 6 core capabilities, which every organization can use to develop a structural way in which you can develop analytics and big data capabilities within your organization. In today's session, we unfortunately don't have the time to go in all 6 or to provide you more background around the Enterprise Big Data Framework. I've done quite a number of different webinars already on this topic. So if you're interested in having more background around the Enterprise Big Data Framework, I would strongly recommend you to either watch one of the other videos or to download the book, which is free of charge, available on the website. What we're going to focus on today is specifically the center part. The center part of the Big Data Framework talks about the need to establish a big data strategy. And what I will do in today's session is going to dive slightly deeper into why is that necessary and what are the main components that build up this enterprise big data strategy. Good. Let's dive a little bit deeper into this. And before we get started on a discussion around the need to establish a big data strategy, I'd like to take you on a journey on one of my favorite quotes. And that's the quote that you see here on the left-hand side of the screen. You might recognize it from one of the books or even the movie. The quote says that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And for the people who find the smile familiar, this quote is coming from the children's book, Alice in Wonderland. For those of you who are not familiar with the book or the movie, which I can almost not imagine, but let me do a very brief explanation. Alice is a small little girl that falls down the rabbit hole and comes into a magical world. But Alice is lost. And she panics and starts to walk in every single direction. Up until the moment that she arrives at the crossroad. And at the crossroad, there's a very big tree and there's a very big purple cat that has this particular smile. And the cat asks Alice, well, where are you going? And then Alice obviously answers, well, I don't know. And then the cat gives this very famous phrase, which I think is very close to the essence of strategy, is that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And this is what I've seen very strongly in big data organizations. There is so much data out there, and there is so many potential use cases, potential benefits of starting with data, that it's very, very hard to make this successful if you don't have a clear strategy in place. So if I were to change this quote a little bit, saying, well, if you don't know where you're going, all the data will get you there. And that's a fairly a good analogy of the primary struggle that we're trying to overcome with establishing a big data strategy. So I hope you find this quote as useful as I find it, because it shows how important this is. A big data strategy, for that reason, is also positioned at the center of the Enterprise Big Data Framework. Because without a good big data strategy, most organizations will fail to realize the benefits that they're looking for. Well, let's dive a little bit deeper into how do you establish that. And what we've learned over the last 5 to 7 years when we were creating the framework is that in order to establish a sound big data strategy, there's a very simple 5-step procedure that you can take. And regardless on whether your company is in oil and gas or a government, these steps fairly match well towards arriving at a strategy that is tangible, that has measurable results, and that is also lasting. And I will explain each of those 5 stages a little bit more in detail as we go along. As you might have noticed, this is a cyclical or circular approach. And that means that you're truly never done with establishing a big data strategy, because as the closer you get towards accomplishing it and embedding it into your organization, the closer you are to the need to redefine or restart or rethink your strategy again. And that's also one of the main key takeaways that I want you to realize. Big data strategy is so important that you need to start refining that with every step along the way. Good, let's look a little bit more into the individual steps. And step number one is probably one of the most crucial ones. In order to make a big data strategy successful, you first need to have a discussion around what are your business objectives. And that sounds very logical, but what I've seen in practice in a lot of organizations that there is this large disconnect towards the goals that are being tried to accomplish through the use of big data technology versus what is the overall corporate strategy and what are the targets that are set in that particular strategy. So the first step that you need to do before you do anything else is to have a closer look and understand your corporate business objectives for your particular enterprise. Is it to grow? Is it to gain market share? Is it to become more profitable? Is it to launch more innovative products in new markets? Any company, regardless of size or industry, will have a number of corporate business objectives. And what all of those corporate business objectives have in common is that they're typically expressed in terms of a number of tangible or measurable metrics, which in most businesses are called business KPIs or key performance indicators. Before you start defining your big data strategy, you need to have a very true and important understanding of what is your organization trying to accomplish. I'm quite serious about this because it sounds like such an easy exercise, but in reality, this is very difficult. I've seen the most beautiful big data strategies that were so disconnected from the rest of the organization that it was almost painful in order to make sure that people understood that this is a mismatch. So start with that particular part. And also note that if you don't know what those are, that is probably a very good first place to get started. The second step that we find always very then effective, as soon as you know what your business objectives are, is to conduct what we refer to as a current state assessment. And in very simple words, I've tried to highlight some of the key activities there. In order to make sure that you can formulate a big data strategy in the first place, you need to know what are your business processes, which data sources do you have, which data assets do you have access to, where they're kept, where is your enterprise data store, which technology capabilities do you have, are there any processes from a security or privacy point of view that might be impeding on your progress to formulate or exploit that data. Having a sound understanding of where your organization is today is a crucial point towards defining a big data strategy in the longer term. And one of the most important things to also take into consideration within that current state assessment is to also look at your people component. Do you have the knowledge and skills in-house to actually do this? And if you don't, what would be the way to start developing that? Conducting a current state assessment from a big data point of view is typically done in a series of interviews. You can use questionnaires. There's a variety of different tools available to actually do this. But this will give you very quickly and typically within a 2 to 3 week period of time, an overview of where your current capabilities are. And the reason that this is important is to set realistic expectations when you start in the next stage to define a big data strategy. And the analogy that you see here on the screen in terms of the pictures is that many companies want to take big and ambitious steps when it comes towards data analytics, big data, and even things like machine learning or artificial intelligence. And don't take me wrong, that's perfectly fine. However, it's very difficult to start building self-driving cars if you don't have any technology even or to do a simple analytics observations, or if you don't have any data scientists or data engineers in-house. So the main reason why this current state assessment is so tremendously important is because it will first and foremost give you an overview of what your current capabilities are. And this will ensure that there's not going to be a big mismatch between your ambitions versus what is a reality today. It's always healthy to have a little bit of a gap. So the fact that you don't have all the capabilities in place is fine, because that's where we have resources for. But if the gap is too large, then typically you're set up for failure right from the start, and your big data strategy is not going to be executed successfully because the knowledge or capability gap is too large to cross. And in the analogy that I've been using from the bridge, if you have the two different points that you need to connect that are so far away, then no matter what kind of structure or bridge you're building, it becomes very difficult to find an adequate structure. So that's the second step in the successful execution of a big data strategy. In step number 3, we're going to be bringing those two different elements together. So in the first step, we have defined business objectives, and we know what the organization aims for, what are the strategic priorities. In step number 2, we looked at where the current capabilities of the enterprise actually are, and what are achievable and measurable projects that can be realized within a set period of time. In step number 3, we're bringing that together. And in step number 3, what we're going to be doing is identifying and prioritizing use cases. Use cases are measurable, tangible projects that can be executed with the use of big data. Each of those individual use cases will lead towards a number of tangible results. Remember that all the way at the start of the webinar, I said, well, one of the biggest problems with formulating a big data strategy is that many companies find it difficult to articulate value. They find it difficult to articulate where they're going to get a return on their investment and the money that they've spent. In step number 3, this is the key critical point that we're trying to address. So by making the strategy tangible into a number of use cases that might be valuable for your organization, and which typically represent a dollar value or a return on investment over a longer period of time, you just start justifying investments in all the technology, knowledge, and skills that you need to set this up. Many organizations will typically be able to formulate anywhere between a dozen to 2 dozen different use cases. And the second part of this step is then to have a closer look at how do you prioritize these use cases. And as with any good model, there's always a matrix with 2 different axes. And the recommended weight, or at least how we have always done the prioritization of use cases, is to look at 2 axes. One is the feasibility axis, and that has a lot to do with that second step, which is your current capability. And the vertical axis is impact, which has everything to do with your business priorities. So here on the slide, which is researched by McKinsey, and I've quoted the source underneath, and you can Google this article and you'll find the exact same picture. Here you see 15 different use cases that have been listed, from sales and customer relationship management all the way to innovation. The particular examples are obviously going to be different from organization to organization. But what I think is one of the main key takeaways that is going to be very useful is that by having this visualization, you can immediately see that projects 7, 8, and 10 in this particular example would be the highest priority use cases, because both from a business impact, think back about step number 1, as well as from a feasibility impact, think back about step number 2 that we just discussed. These are crucial elements and projects and use cases that don't just have a monetary reward, they're also executable in terms of your current capabilities. Creating a graph like this is by no means an easy exercise. And I've done this many times, and it typically leads towards a lot of different discussions, because people who are in the data science or big data domains typically think that feasibility is way higher than people for instance, on the business side believe. But my experience as well is that having this discussion in the first place is a very valuable exercise. So I also strongly recommend to do this in teams, in larger teams where there is input from both business as well as the data science, big data skills and knowledge, because that will help you to establish a sound overview and to prioritize use cases in an adequate fashion. Good. With step 3, we're identifying and selecting a number of projects that are linked towards our strategic objectives and which are feasible to implement. Having said that, we're moving towards step number 4, which is the formulation of your big data roadmap. I've deliberately kept this slide a little bit vague in terms of implementation, because this is going to be different for every single organization. The main thing that I want you to see is that based on your current capabilities, which we've covered in step number 2, and the identified and prioritized use cases that we've covered in the previous step, we can now start to establish a roadmap. In the example that we've seen on the previous slide, we saw projects 7, 8, and 10. And that would be the projects that would be at the top of a roadmap. A good big data roadmap, therefore, outlines which projects or use cases will be executed first and for what particular reason. And they also tend to have a more detailed business case around it. So what will be the return on investment of executing that strategy, and what will be the capabilities required. This roadmap typically is made around a 3 to 5 year term. So it's really useful to do this from a longer term perspective so that it shows exactly to everyone what the longer term objectives of big data are going to be. Good. We're almost getting toward the final step of the big data strategy cycle. But the last step is also one that I would really strongly like to highlight because it's so very frequently forgotten in organizations. And that is to anchor this strategy. And how do you anchor things in large organizations? Typically, you need a little bit of change management. And what I refer to with change management is involving or convincing the hearts and minds of people. If people are not adequately involved, or if processes or technology or analytics is not properly embedded within the way of working of the organization, then that is also a major risk and your big data strategy is likely to fail. And this is something that is a very real threat in a lot of organizations. You can have all the most beautiful analysis, very sound research, but for instance, if people then don't take decisions based on what the data tells you, then ultimately that will also be considered a failure from a big data perspective. And this is a thing that is not to be underestimated. Moving towards a data-driven big data organization requires changing the way people work, the way that they think, and also requires a bit of culture change. It all starts with realizing and establishing that data-driven decisions are typically more valuable and provide more tangible results in the longer run. So embedding your big data strategy through a number of cultural programs, incentives, or measuring its success through a number of ongoing metrics should be key part of any of your strategies that you're executing. This is the last step in the successful 5-step approach of establishing a big data strategy and how you can formulate it. Let me give you a very brief recap of what we've just discussed. In the last 20-25 minutes, I've taken you through the 5 critical steps to formulate a big data strategy. This step starts with defining business objectives, which links your strategy for big data towards your corporate objectives. The second main objective is then to look at your current capabilities. What is your organization able to handle, and what do you currently have in order to access data What kind of skills do you have? What kind of technology is in-house with which you could realize these objectives? In step number 3, we linked the two together. And this is where we looked at the identification and prioritization of different use cases. I've shown you the 2x2 matrix with which you can identify projects based on feasibility as well as business impact. And that will lead towards a tangible list of a number of use cases which you can start to realize through big data and which will have a tangible return on investment. Based on these projects, you can then start to formulate a big data roadmap. The roadmap will be a prioritized list of projects, which will have a more detailed overview of your financials, resources, timelines, and project management planning. The last and very crucial step in order to make the circle round is to embed your strategy through change management. Establish metrics and incentives which will help you to measure whether your big data strategy is executed and implemented successfully. And please again note that this is a cycle. These 5 different steps need to be redone every 2 to 3 years to come up with a more up-to-date and refined vision of your big data strategy. Good. And at the beginning of this webinar, I also promised that I would show you some examples and research where you can find some good strategies. And one of the public available sources that is available for everyone is the Big Data Strategy that is available at the United Nations. I've listed the link on the slide right here. And here you see on a very high level, it's actually quite a detailed report on what are some of the strategic choices that have been made within the UN with regards to processing their big data. What you will see if you look at the table of contents is that it fairly well matches the 5-step approach that I just mentioned. The only thing that they didn't really look at, and which I think they should, is the embedding it through change management. They do really carefully look at the people aspect, but not the anchoring of the strategy from a longer term perspective. So strongly recommend you to have and download this resource because I think it shows you a good step-by-step approach and a more detailed overview of how you could do this. And it will show you also some of the different factors that come into play from a more partnership governance and strategy overview, which we don't have time to focus on today. Good. I hope you find these 30 minutes webinars useful, and I hope you learned something new around the steps that you would need in order to create a big data strategy. If you're interested to pursuing this further, there's a couple of steps I can recommend you to take. First of all, note that the Enterprise Big Data Framework is there for the advancement of big data best practices, which means that all of the content and materials are available as free downloads. So you can download, go to the website, download all of the free big data guides. There you can learn these steps in more detail. The model that I've presented today is actually written down within that book as well. So it shows you what you can do in order to learn more about it. So no commitments, you can just download that for free. Strongly recommend that you do that. For the people who want to take it a notch up, note that there's also official certifications available. So we've partnered with APMG to do international accredited examinations around these topics. They're currently available in English and Chinese. So that's where you can get started with learning in a more formal way. Also note that besides these webinars, I have a podcast which is available on YouTube and the Apple podcast store. So if you type in Big Data Talks, you can listen to me and interviewing some industry experts around the ways that they are taking to transform their organization. Another thing that you can do is sign up for our yearly event, which is Big Data Days, which is also completely free of charge. It's a 2-day virtual event which features speakers from leading minds from all across the world, ranging from the US all the way towards Australia. If you're interested in that, you do need to wait a little bit longer because Big Data Days has just happened in May. So the next one is not planned for another 11 months. But all the recordings from previous month are available on YouTube as well or on the Big Data Framework website. So you can still watch back and learn a lot of those. There were actually quite a number of sessions there this year on big data strategy as well. So if you want to learn something more and listen to some other leading minds in the industry, make sure that you review those recordings as well. Good. With that, we are getting towards the end of our session today. Let me see if there are any questions, or if you would like to ask any questions, you can now post them into the Q&A box on the left-hand side. No, I don't see any questions coming in right now. So if there are no other questions, I would like to thank everyone for their time and attention today. It's always a pleasure to host these sessions. Make sure you sign up for our next webinar, which is going to be around big data architecture. So if you're interested a little bit more in the technology side of things, please sign up for our architecture. Oh, I see one question come in, so I will still cover that real quickly. The question is, what is the disadvantage of big data? Well, let me be very frank and honest about that. The disadvantage of big data is that it requires a lot of preparation, thought, and an adequate strategy to make it successful. Doing big data or establishing a big data strategy that actually works is not something that you kind of devise in a week. So data-driven analysis and decision-making, in my opinion, does not have a lot of disadvantages. Where the disadvantages is that it requires a significant amount of effort to do it well. And if you don't do it well, then it will lead towards a lot of failed projects. It will lead towards people who are not going to be happy around the results. And it will be very difficult to get a particular positive return on investment. Good. Then I see another quick question coming in. Oh, it's not a question. It says, no question. Wanted to thank you for raising the importance of change management in making the strategy a reality. So thank you, Melanie. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you will also think and read more about the model, and that you'll hopefully find it useful. Good. With that, we are already 5 minutes over time. So if there are no other questions, I'm going to close the session for today. Thanks so much again for tuning in today on the 6th of the 6th. And I look forward to seeing any of you again in any of our other upcoming sessions. Thanks, everyone.